I'm worried. No.
You're good? Oh, I think that we are live.
Great. So welcome. Thank you for tolerating a quick technical issue. I'm Joe Foti. I work for the independent reporting mechanism of OGP, and I'm pleased to have this event, this Facebook Live event today. This is a milestone for us. Many years ago at the steering committee meeting of OGP, the independent reporting mechanism was told you need to do a final accounting of every single OGP commitment and where they are at the end of each 2-year action plan. So here we are almost 3 years later with the final accounting from those commitments at that time, from those action plans. And we're going to be able to discuss what did we learn from them? What does it mean for OGP overall? And we're going to show you some numbers and then discuss what the strategic and implications are for OGP as a whole. So I'm joined today by my colleague Laura Vossler, who's here, who is going to be sharing with you the data from what we call end-of-term reports. I am joined by 3 members of the International Experts Panel, and many of those of you who are joining us today know that the International Experts Panel are the bosses of the independent reporting mechanism. So there are 10 of them. Today we have 3. We have Brendan Halloran here. We have Hille Hinsberg joining us from Estonia, and we have Jeff Lovitt also here joining us from Czech Republic. And so without further ado, Laura, go ahead and we can begin.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start today by sharing a PowerPoint slide. We're also going to share this PowerPoint with you in the links. We'll tweet it out later. And this is going to be just a bit of a discussion about some of the numbers that we and data that we found from our big question, which is race to the top, and what sort of early evidence we found from this second year end of term reports on OGP action plan. So this slide is just sketching out the OGP universe. I know that a lot of you are quite familiar with all things OGP, but just a quick recap. Each participating country brings together government and civil society to co-develop a national action plan. These national action plans are composed of commitments, which are activities designed in collaboration between government and civil society to improve transparency, accountability, and civic participation. The IRM writes 2 assessment reports during the 2-year life cycle of OGP action plans. The midterm report, which is here, comes after the first year of implementation and is intended to measure progress on implementing commitments, as well as offer concrete recommendations to help inform the next action plan cycle. The end of term report, which was just introduced this past year, comes at the end of the 2 years of implementation and is intended to give a final account of progress made on commitments. Essentially, did it open government, and did the government do what it said it was going to do? So today, what we're looking at is over the last 2 years, between 2014 and 2016, approximately 60 action plans were implemented. Right now, we're finishing up producing 44 end-of-term reports. And today's data is based on 23 out of those 44 reports. This represents approximately 1/3 of the commitments that were generated and implemented over the last 2 years. And this data is, again, preliminary, so we will be inputting more information as more end-of-term reports are finalized, and we welcome inputs from you about some of the findings, because this will turn into a paper later on. So please, we look forward to your inputs, but also recognize that this is preliminary, and we will have additional information as more becomes available. Yeah. So the first order question is, do countries do what they said they were going to do, and did anything happen in the second year of OGP action plans? This is something that's come up a lot in the OGP community, and is something that the IRM is starting to tackle. You know, OGP cynics might say that governments do all their work in the first year and then lose momentum, while optimists might say that a lot of work is done through the 2-year cycle. But the question is, who's right? Before now, we weren't able to assess this because we simply didn't look at any information after the first year of implementation. But now that we've introduced the end of term reports, we can look into the data to start to answer this. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the fable of the tortoise and the hare, but this quick summary of it is the tortoise and the hare were in a race to get to the finish line. The hare bounded ahead very quickly, but also lost steam, whereas the tortoise was slow and steady, but wound up finishing the race. So we think this actually winds up being pretty representative for our sample here. This chart shows the percentage of completed commitments by country year in year one, which is the part that is in blue right here, and the percentage of completed commitments by the end of the second year, which is in red right here. And so what we found was that there were hare countries. There were countries that made a lot of progress on completion during the first year. And there were tortoise countries that made the majority of their progress on completion during the second year. And as you can see, there's also a group in between. These ones were the ones that did not manage to make it to the finish line. They did not have any commitments that were completed during the 2 years of the action plan cycle. But what was really interesting about this is that the countries that were able to complete their commitments during the second year actually made a lot of progress. What we can see is, for example, Paraguay had only 11% of completion in the first year, but went up to 89% completion in the second year. So one of the questions might be, is this a representative sample? Again, we're looking at a quarter of the action plans. And is this completion rate typical for OGP countries? So if you are familiar with the second IRM technical paper, it showed that the average completion for OGP countries at the midterm was about 20%. So it's very similar to what the UK has, about here at 18%. And what we found is that the average rate of completion for this sample country, these sample of countries, was 18%. And at the end of term, the average rate of completion was 35%. So we can say that, yes, completion has improved between the midterm and the end of term. But you might ask, what does this matter? Because it's all well and good for a commitment to be completed, but is it a good commitment? Is it something that actually opens up government practice and makes things more transparent and accountable for citizens? So over the past 4 years, the IRM and the greater OGP community has come to learn that there are 4 elements that make a commitment good. And the IRM has brought these elements together into the measurement that we call START. So a quick recap for those who are not necessarily familiar with OGP and the START commitment measurement. In order for a commitment to be START, it has to be specific. The commitment language can't be vague. You need to know what the activity is and be able to measure progress. The commitment needs to demonstrate that it is relevant to improving access to information, civic participation, or public accountability. And if fully implemented, would the commitment matter? And finally, has this commitment been put into motion? Has significant progress been made on completion? So the first 3 elements here, specificity, relevance, and high potential impact, are based on how the commitment is written. So they don't change between the midterm and the end of term. And if a commitment is already well written, but didn't necessarily make significant progress during the first year, there is a potential for that commitment to earn a star by improving on completion. So the question is, did we see that happen? Did we see more star commitments at the end of term? And let me walk you through this graph before I tell you. So first off, we can see on the x-axis, which is the part down below, these are all of our countries. And on the y-axis, we're seeing the number of commitments going up to 4 commitments. And what we see in these orange bars is movement from the midterm to the end of term. So you see countries such as Albania right here that moved from having 0 commitments that were starred in the midterm to having 1 commitment that was starred in the end of term. So what is exciting about this sample size is over half, this whole group right here, of the commitments had at least 1 star, 1 major reform during the 2-year action plan cycle. And a third of these commitments, the group right here, had gained at least 1 star during the end of term. So this is very exciting. It shows that there is a group of countries that made significant reforms that we otherwise would not have been able to capture if we had stopped assessing during the first year of implementation. So we also think that this is really important because the OGP community at large uses STAR commitments to celebrate and uphold the civil society members that champion these reforms and the public servants that marshal the resources in place to make these things happen. And without these end of term reports, we would have missed it entirely. But again, as I was saying earlier, with the requirements for STAR commitments, the STAR formula relies heavily upon potential impact, but what about actual changes? So, to get to that, we wanted to look at this: do good commitments lead to changes in behavior? And we struggled with this question within the IRM. And that's why we introduced a new metric in the end of term reports called Did It Open Government? And a good example of why we needed Did It Open Government to tell a more complete story about change in government practice comes from the first Argentinian action plan. So this here is former Argentinian President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. And before the OGP action plan, there were allegations of corruption around a public contract deal involving members of her family. And the Supreme Court was supporting an investigation into these allegations. Interestingly, one of the OGP commitments was to introduce a court of appeals below the Supreme Court. So, did this open government? It's a good question. And we struggle to assess this because, on the one hand, some stakeholders felt that additional justices would open up access to the judiciary by allowing for more cases to be heard and to reduce the backlog, while others felt that this allowed for the president to stack the courts and would water down justice. We knew that this was a high impact commitment, but we didn't know and weren't able to measure based on how it was written the full implication of how this change would affect openness and access to justice. So this Did It Open Government variable looks at change along a spectrum from outstanding change in government practice all the way to worsens, because we want to acknowledge that just because a commitment sounds good, the way that it's implemented could actually worsen the situation at hand. So we want to have that full spectrum and look at that. So what's the final verdict? You're going to have to read the end of term report when it comes out early next year to find out. But to answer the question of do good commitments lead to good behavior, we looked into the relationship between STAR commitments and commitments that were found to be outstanding in terms of Did It Open Government. And so what we can see here is that there's a sample group of all commitments, 339. Of that group, 32 of them were starred at the end of term. And then within that group, there's another group of outstanding commitments. And this doesn't fully track between the two because there were some starred commitments that were not outstanding, and there were some outstanding commitments that were not starred. But what we were able to see is essentially having a STAR commitment, a commitment that is well conceived, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a meaningful change in government practice. And we can open this up to the IEP to discuss further what would be some of the necessary and sufficient conditions for having meaningful reforms and change. But that was an interesting and exciting finding. So to sum it up, we'll do a little true or false exercise. First, most of the action takes place in the second year. So to go back to the tortoise and hare fable, this is a mixed bag. The majority of countries did make the majority of their progress in the first year, but those countries that made progress in the second year made significant progress. We need a second year assessment to find the best commitments. True, as we showed with the increase in STAR commitments, if we stop assessing at the midterm, we miss out on a wealth of countries that are continuing to do good work on meaningful and potentially transformative commitments. And so we would need to have a second year assessment to capture this. And then finally, well-conceived commitments lead to big outcomes. And so what we saw is a well-conceived commitment is a necessary condition, but not necessarily sufficient. It is possible, in theory, for there to be a commitment that is not well written, and it's difficult for the IRM to parse out based on how it's written. But more often than not, a well-written and thought-through commitment leads to meaningful change and big outcomes in government practice in these important areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joe, who will start asking the IEP some hard but interesting questions.
Great. Thanks, Laura. That was really compelling and interesting. So Laura is in the beginning stages of writing, as she said, of writing a longer paper that will explore what all of these end-of-term reports say, all of them. And so your questions, comments on Facebook Live, or emails to us, irmopengovpartnership.org, will be helpful in what the community would find to be the most interesting questions, and they would help inform that paper. But before we do that, we're going to shift from the numbers to deep thinking about what this means strategically for OGP and what it means for the IRM. So with that, I'm going to turn to Hille first. Hille, what do you think is the most important contribution of the end of term reports, or your two reports that we're doing based on what you've read?
First of all, I think that we do acknowledge that reforms happen over time, and they are not exactly matching the 2-year cycle that we have chosen to just make a snapshot of the accountability. Is it happening, what was pledged to happen, and to capture the progress at this point. But I think one of the lessons from here is also that it's perfectly okay to divide policy interventions over a longer time, but just be very focused and very specific on what you set out to achieve during this cycle of 1 year and 2 years. And so coming back to the question, yes, we do have a very good picture from the end of term reports, but we don't want to miss out the midterm progress reports. That is also one of the products that IRM is making. Why? Because that is feeding in to the stakeholders' view, and that is also giving them the picture on how good was the design in the first place. Laura was telling us that you have to really get it right from the start, because the only thing that you can change during the course of action is push towards completion. But you have to nail the action plan from the start, being clearly relevant, specific, ambitious enough, and also balance it with some kind of feasibility. So sitting around the table with the stakeholders is one thing that I heartily recommend any government to do at any times, but also in connection with setting out and designing a down-to-earth, a practical, but still an ambitious and a clearly expressed action plan. I think this data shows that it pays off.
Thanks. So I recently received an email from an geopolitically important government saying the IRM should stop measuring completion at the midterm. Now that you have these end-of-term reports coming out, it's unfair to us. My instinct tells me there's still some value to the midterm report measuring completion. What do you think, Hille?
Well, again, it's a sort of accountability that for the wider circle of stakeholders, just get signals, get an indicator, something is going on. And it's also a very good point in time to get active and get proactive in striving towards a better way to achieve what you set out to do. So I think we need both pictures, and but midterm progress report done by RM comes at a better time to give feedback into the new cycle. So I think we are valuing it because this snapshot that Laura was showing us is a hindsight. but only at midterm point there is this window of opportunity to, first of all, to push forward, and secondly, to have the signals, to have the feedback, to have the neutral picture that we are hoping to give in order to design a better new cycle, a new action.
Great. So, Brendan, I'm just going to go for a few questions with these guys before we go to questions from the live stream. Brendan, should everyone be shooting for outstanding commitments? How many should they be shooting for? How many star commitments? And is 2 years realistic? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, a reality check is 10 out of 339 commitments were outstanding, right? So those are the commitments that we saw immediate evidence of really meaningful change in government practice. That is, of course, what the open government stands for. It stands for changing the way that business is done in a way that is more open to citizens and more accountable to them. That said, as Hille alluded to, these are real life reform processes. They're tricky, they're challenging. 2-year cycles, we can talk a little bit about how those match up with actual kind of cycles of reform processes. So yes, overall, we want, and I think all of OGP stakeholders agree that this initiative is about maximizing the value of changing government practice. So we would want to see better, more better design commitments that achieve meaningful progress as measured by the STAR status. Arguably, more importantly, we would want to see more commitments that are starting to demonstrate meaningful outcomes in terms of the did it open government variable at the end of the end of term report. So we would want to see these higher than we're seeing them now. But we shouldn't think that these are snapshots. Some of these initiatives, some of these reforms will bear out over time, over a decade maybe. I think the ones that some of them we can see at the end of the term, okay, it didn't quite have the effect that maybe stakeholders thought it would. Others, we don't really know. Those that are finished right at the end of national action cycles and have implications that are invisible to our kind of end of year reports, our end of term reports. It would be worth, and I hope researchers out there will take a look at these sometime. I mean, can we say that over time the whole was greater than the sum of its parts? Can we see that a number of maybe not outstanding commitments, maybe several major commitments or a major and outstanding and a few minors actually added up to something more meaningful over time? We don't yet know that. I think that's a really interesting question because it tells us about what it takes to make meaningful reform happen over time. So yes and yes, Joe.
I have two examples to support this discussion. I just looked it up. In the US action plan, 21 out of 26 commitments or activities within the action plan were taken over from one cycle to another. So it is not a bad thing to have, to be very specific in sort of dividing the intervention over time, to actually aim higher, to at some point of time, at some end of term report done by RM, to be claiming the success that has accumulated over these cycles. So it's perfectly okay to set milestones and to be feasible enough not to want to accomplish big reforms.
I think it's clear to have more impact that we need, as was stressed at the beginning, we need a well-written commitment, but also we need follow-through. And I think when we're measuring it, as well as whether commitments are carried forward, it's also the issue of does it kind of create space for much more, I'd say, civil society engagement? Because one of the cores of the OGP, which makes it different, is citizens' engagement in the policy process. And if you look at a lot of the commitments are on open data, a lot are on access to information, and in themselves they don't necessarily achieve anything, but they create the space for other actors, other stakeholders. And one example I think it wasn't one of these end of terms, it was the Macedonian Moje Studie initiative, where releasing the open data meant civil society were able to develop apps, civil society awareness was built up, this was around air pollution, and from that different initiatives come and pressures on the policy-making process, which is why I think the did it open government question being added is so important, but perhaps we have to think how we can really measure that over time. To what extent you need stakeholder consultations about did it open government? What really are the measures? And I think this is a challenge we could go forward, and it would be good to see if people are listening in and what suggestions they have, because it's very important that it's not a subjective opinion of one researcher, although we try to review it as well as possible. But did it open government can be a very long-term process, and we have to make sure it's not, is there an immediate impact, but we ignore something which has perhaps got a more holistic long-term impact.
I have one example again of that, because I've been, it's absolutely amazing what Croatia has been doing in the field of online consultations. And I see it in different action plans, that they have a set of milestones, they have a set of activities that kind of reinforce the official, the formal consultation processes over time. They have the legal act. They are supporting and rebuilding the consultation portal. They are training civil servants. They are, of course, engaging with civil society stakeholders on a permanent basis. So they add up to the initial steps over time. And now we have seen within, I think, this end of term report, that this has been paid off in the form of other policies, not open government policies, not open data policies, but other policies being made following this model, using the consultation, making the engagement in a structured way in order to really influence the outcomes. For example, the corruption strategy was drafted exactly in the way that we'd like to see it happen in any policy areas. So if this model of being engaging, participatory, accountable, translates into other policy areas, I think that could be one of the indicators to really see that, yes, reforms do happen, and yes, they do disseminate across governance.
And I think also with Croatia, you see in the development consultation on the action plans, there were CSOs involved in the working groups developing. And I noticed there were 2 stark commitments, one from Croatia, one from Romania, on fairly similar areas, on basically online publishing of legislation. But there was a distinct difference, which is probably why Croatia got an outstanding, Romania didn't, was that Croatian model included online consultation from the very first drafts of legislation, whereas the Romanian was just publishing the legislation. I mean, there's work still to be done on the Croatian case, like I think the civil society groups were saying this should be applied at the local and the regional level as well as the national level. But it's certainly one of those countries where there's been changes of government, but it's one of those countries where I think other OGP countries.
Great. So that brings me to the question of we have all these STAR commitments, and then we're moving to only a subset of those got outstanding, right? So we know, Hille's told us, Laura's told us, okay, we know the ones that are well drafted. We know the ones that are meaning irrelevant, specific, explain what problem they're trying to solve. They're ambitious, and they're feasible are there. So that's like in commitment design. What are the missing ingredients? Jeff mentioned civic space and some buy-in where people can actually use them. But what are the other missing ingredients in getting us from well-conceived commitments to high big results?
Well, the obvious one is political will.
Can you unpack that a little?
Well, I mean, in terms of it, it's fine to have on paper strong commitments, but the follow-through is clearly necessary. And this would come, for instance, if you're monitoring lawmaking processes, you need the political will to ensure that all the ministries, all the government agencies have buy-in and actually implement it. But you also need, I would say, qualified, competent, expert civil society. If civil society has a seat on the table but doesn't understand the drafting process of laws or doesn't have the expertise in this, if it's about environment, then they're not going to be perhaps invited again. Whereas if they come and they bring added value, then clearly there's going to be a kind of, well, basically it'll be a win-win. It'll be an incentive for both sides to sit together at the same table. The political will obviously depends not just on one individual, it has to be sustained. We see so many governments. I live in the Czech Republic, the government has just resigned. It's so common now to see changes. We've seen it in the case of Croatia, we've seen Serbia has had might be having a fourth parliamentary election in the space of 3 years. So it's very difficult. And it often depends, again, on the strength and quality of the public officials, the civil servants. If the civil servants can keep continuity. I think this was raised in a previous session by Mary on Canada, that despite perhaps the government, the Harper government of Canada, not having so much interest in open government, the momentum was kept by committed public servants. So I think that's also.
Yeah, that last point was supported by our analysis. The technical paper, the second one, is called Beyond the Basics, that we put out a few months ago, showed that it's actually statistically significant that if you have a stable office of civil servants, it has more influence over the levels of completion than the president staying the same. It's more disruptive to change the civil servants than to change the head of government, which is interesting.
I think just to balance it somehow, because however strong or active the civil society stakeholders can be, they can't do much in order, for this kind of political fluctuations, or even civil servants rotating off together with ministers. So really, you have to handle the situation, you cannot influence it. But what you can influence from the table when designing the action plan is that to be very careful on and ambitious in finding the right problem, actually, that to tackle with these kind of interventions that we have here, because you brought the Macedonian example. The air quality is the problem, and open data is means to it. So it's only valuable to use this kind of tools and instruments when you're actually going after a bigger goal of creating the well-being and creating, security, stability, quality of life, and so on. So yes, you can achieve something towards it using this open governance, open government instruments.
So we have too many solutions in search of problems, and we need more.
Stay focused on the problem.
Yeah.
You cannot claim that by building one kind of consultation portal or even permanent multi-stakeholder forum that you will solve the air quality forever. No, of course not. But focus on the problem and then find the ways to move towards it using the open government values.
Yeah, to add to that, I think that sometimes what you see is fairly low-hanging fruit. What things that get completed are things that government can do fairly easily. A lot of the transparency commitments, opening data, can be done without, not to say that it's not complex in and of itself, but it's easier than robust, meaningful citizen engagement and public accountability. So you see a fair degree of public accountability and civic engagement commitments that are consultation with citizens. Citizens can provide information or a complaint mechanism. Those are easier, less contentious, but also have less teeth in terms of actually giving citizens a meaningful influence on decision making or play a meaningful role in holding government to account. Now, this gets us back into the question of how those kinds of reforms are tricky. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. They require political will. They require deft, bureaucrats. They require attentive and engaged civil society. They also require the public to actually care about these things, right? And them to be meaningfully involved. So those stars don't always align, and we shouldn't expect that they will always align. But that's the kind of thing that we would need to see to kind of scale up the number of both starred and kind of outstanding commitments over time.
Thanks.
One data point that I would like to add that I think is really interesting, especially when we're talking about this low-hanging fruit and balancing ambition versus implementation for stakeholders. One thing that we did look into is we looked into the level of ambition, so the potential impact, and then the rate of completion at the end of term. And what we found is that commitments that had minor or no potential impact were completed at a lower rate, actually, slightly lower, but a lower rate than those commitments that had transformative potential impact and were completed at the end of term. So yes, we're working with a smaller sample size of transformative commitments, but if it's a question of trying to figure out, should we put our resources towards these low-hanging fruit commitments that are easy to implement versus a slightly harder but transformative commitments, we found that they're completed at roughly the same rates. So if you can find a way to make it feasible within the 2-year cycle, there is some evidence to show that governments are getting this completed and that they should strive for more transformative commitments because they can get completed.
I mean, we don't want to say that government shouldn't be doing tweaks that are useful, but not transformative. They should be doing those as well, but they need to balance that, right? And also do things that citizens and the public finds more meaningful.
And this is why we don't release the percent of stars anymore, because the goal is not to get 100% of your commitments to be starred or outstanding. The goal is to have a lot of those. Yes, still as many as possible. But it's also okay to do housekeeping. It's okay to do things that are important. It might not change society forever. And we recognize that. How are we? I have one more question, or we can shift to questions from the audience. Should we keep
Let's
going?
take your remarks.
Okay, we'll do one more question. So this question is for Brendan and Laura. There are areas that we saw in this? I know it's a small sample of only 10 outstanding commitments, but then we have how many major?
68 or so.
So major is the next level down, meaning that there's still actually, we saw major changes in government openness. So that's actually a pretty big and nice number. And our colleague Renzo, who's not here, always tells us major's pretty cool too. So out of those, out of them, are we seeing any trends? Are there more transparency commitments? Are there more accountability commitments? Laura, I know you have the numbers. Brendan, I know you have some insight into that.
Sure. Yeah, so the way to get a little bit into the weeds, the way that we do measure digital open government is along the OGP values. So we're looking at it in terms of access to information, civic participation, and public accountability. And what we saw is that 84% of commitments are relevant to access to information. So they have some component of it that is operating in that level. And then it goes down from there. Civic participation is about 35%, and public accountability is struggling at about 30%. So this kind of plays into what Brendan was saying earlier, is that we have a lot of commitments that are focused on transparency, on open data, and that is something that is important. But if we want to talk about some rebalancing things that might also help to deal with some of the civic space issues that Jeff brought up, there is definitely an opportunity and room for there to be increases in civic participation and public accountability, because that's not as represented in the sample size.
And I mean, taking a step back, I think open government has long been associated with transparency, and that's part of an important part of the definition, but it doesn't encompass the whole of what it means to be a government that is open to public engagement, public scrutiny, and citizens being able to hold their government to account. So there is still some lingering, vestiges of that kind of narrower definition or narrower understanding of open government that we see in the actual commitments themselves. But if many of our audience will probably have been to recent OGP summits in Mexico City and in Paris, and there's definitely two conversations going on at those meetings. There's a really optimistic conversation that says, look at these innovative practices that are getting done. Then there's a fair bit of angst about the risks that we see of rollback and of social, political, and economic trends that are going in the other direction that Jeff alluded to. So, that means that that raises the question of, are citizens, what they're demanding is only more transparency and open data, or are they demanding governments to be accountable to them in the face of rising inequality, in the face of populist movements, which don't have the same respect for the rule of law that we would like to see. So I think that if we kind of look at a bigger picture perspective, we see citizens in the street demanding accountability. We've seen it in country after country after country. I think transparency is a big part of that solution, but I think we need to have open government be meaningfully about governments that are accountable to their citizens first and foremost. And that's not just means more public accountability commitments, but that means more robust commitments that are really meeting what citizens are demanding from their governments around the world.
I see presentations by civil society groups at OGP meetings, and I wonder, sometimes I see them just put transparency and participation and not put accountability there. Is that because they're being strategic and they know that's the hard one to get politicians to agree to put in their action plan? Or is it a failure of imagination or policy knowledge? Why do we see even civil society organizations who are often supposed to be the harder advocates, and you guys sometimes dropping that off? I can understand why governments do. I'm more concerned with why civil society groups.
Well, I can take a first shot at that, and then I'm sure you have insights as well. I mean, I think it raises questions, right? One, it raises questions about the representativeness and inclusiveness of civil society at the table in OGP. And I think we've always emphasized that needs to become a bigger and more representative group over time. Doesn't have to be everybody in the room, but I think there's a lot of organizations that have a narrower transparency focus. But I think it says something about civil society. It raises questions that we've talked about already about, the challenge of really meaningful reform processes set against, what is a 2-year national action plan cycle. And so I think there are questions about how long it would take and how OGP can, and we have evidence to suggest that meaningful public accountability reforms can happen within, the context of OGP. But I think we need to be also cognizant of the realities of reform processes and their complexity and their difficulty.
I agree. My explanation is very simple. Having been a civic activist myself, I think civil society groups they take it for granted that with participation, accountability will follow. They have these built-in expectations that their words, their proposals will be taken seriously and be getting the response from the decision makers. I think we might be looking at sort of a language issue here. So it's kind of inherent belief that when an interest group, civil society, formalized group is already making the steps, that accountability will be part of it. So why make it in the first place when it's just trying to fill the air with some empty promises? So I think they are far more realistic than that. They do believe that accountability is important.
It could be also, one of the big challenges is changing the culture of communications.
Yeah.
And I think for civil society, often, if there's the political engagement to communicate much more with civil society, then it becomes less of an issue. But sometimes civil society is in its own kind of ghetto and forgets that doesn't mean that the government is communicating with the wider public. And I think this is going to be a challenge for the OGP, is the co-creation of commitments to see civil society engagement, but also civil society co-implementers. And there's a possible big downside in that, and it takes away the accountability for implementation from the government. So it could actually dilute the responsibility of the government, but it could also push further and make the commitments more ambitious. So I think if you look at the consultation process around shaping the commitments, we get to the consult and the inform, but we don't get so much to the collaborate and empowerment, which I think are the higher scale. We don't see that very often at all, and it'll be very challenging, but also it'll be a test for civil society whether they rise to the challenge, because then the accountability will also be on how they perform. So I think a lot of the commitments may make civil society be more, well, our role is to monitor So our role is actually to hold the governments to account. So maybe that will really bring the public accountability element of the OGP values into the community. That's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out in next years with the new action.
We need a reality check. I mean, I think over 100 public accountability, over 100 commitments that are relevant to public accountability, 2 outstanding and 3 major. That's not very many, and that needs to go up over time.
Yeah. Great. We have questions from the audience.
So actually, our first question, both Hille and everyone answered this question already, which was basically how CSOs can play an oversight role, which is more or less what you were just discussing. The next question we got from Laura, which are the main challenges in terms of the implementation of open government policies at the subnational level?
The subnational level. So we are doing a subnational program. Currently, the subnational entities are implementing it. So we do not yet have the data to really parse out what the challenges are for the group at large. But I would say that some of the challenges are very similar to what happens at the national level. What we have seen, and what I can say anecdotally from the action plans that I've seen, is that there has been a lot more work on making sure that they get the words right and that they figure out how to indicate that if we're going to be working on opening up data sets, they're not saying that transparency is the thing that will make this change happen. It is not that accountability moment. The data sets opening up is the prerequisite to additional work that is done by civil society groups. And so that can really help. That's really helping and moving that along. But we'll have to stay tuned for early 2018 when we'll have initial results on the co-creation process, and then later on the actual outcomes for subnational.
I think one of the things that we've noticed with the 15 subnational governments is what Hille talked about, this problem orientation. They seem to understand that a little bit more intuitively. So it's less, the civil servants there are putting together, if they're going to set up a consultative process, it's to improve municipal zoning. Like, it's a very practical issue, as opposed to, setting up a geospatial database that may be used for a variety of purposes instead of zoning. So it's just one level less abstracted. Of course, then they have the added problems in a lot of places. It's not that national governments don't have of federalism, of devolved funding for these issues. They don't have access to international resources a lot of the same time. So that will be a continued challenge with some of these governments. Also, for the IRM, it may be the independent reporting mechanism may have some difficulty because everyone knows each other in some of these governments. Obviously, you're talking about something different in Ontario than you are in Kigoma province in Kenya, but it's much harder to find people who don't have a dog in the fight, don't have a reputation with each of the with the action plans already. So over time, we'll have to reflect on how the OGP model plays out at the subnational level. And how do we have to provide additional safeguards for the independent researcher? Are there more questions from that?
There's a question. Can you bring up an example of public consultation in regard to developing maps in other countries? And they were looking for an example that stood out, particularly amongst other countries.
Well, Georgia is one good case, I would say, that the locals claim that was actually the first time that a multi-stakeholder forum had an actual say in the outcome. So there was a forum of stakeholders, CSOs, experts, government people, equally around the table. I know for some locations, for some countries, that sounds like a regular process. But in Georgia, it was the first attempt to actually go create the action plan, which they did, and they are going on implementing and monitoring it within the same group as well. So I would say look it up. Georgia, Croatia, also Estonia has this kind of multi-stakeholder forum that is permanently taking the active role in making sure that the activities, the commitments are being taken forward in a way that they set out to do, and also trying to tweak the performance to achieve the goal.
Yeah. One other country that is actually quite interesting is the Philippines. They have a secretariat that is housed under the executive, and they bring together in their OGP steering committee members also from the business community, because one of the big challenges in the Philippines is making sure that there is a good business climate, because they have a lot of multinational corporations. And so a huge part of ensuring that corruption is reduced is also bringing in buy-in from the business community. And so bringing them in, that would be someone that is sort of outside of the usual suspects of the general OGP community, which tends to be governance CSOs and those sorts of organizations. So that's something that is interesting. It has its challenges, and they have had commitments on improving the business climate that they're still trying to figure out how to tweak to work within, actually improving government practice as opposed to just improving corporate practice. But I think it's really great to try and bring in people that don't necessarily always focus on OGP specific governance issues to think about how to come up with creative ways to combat what people on the ground know to be corruption prone areas.
I think there's also the issue of widening it away from the capital cities. And I know in Macedonia, civil society in the regions were involved, but also one of the Skopje civil society groups was also a kind of co-implementer of some of the commitments. And I noticed that Romania, in its next action plan, is going to make sure it's not just Bucharest, but the rest of the country, the civil society groups are also involved in shaping it.
I think one of the challenges countries early on in OGP had was overly centralizing the participation into a single body with a single agency, which was good in the early stages. They needed to have one lead organization, which some of them didn't even have. But now the challenge is moving out to a hub and spoke model, because a lot of the line ministries and agencies have the access to the constituents at the grassroots level. They have access outside of the capital. So your environment ministry already has its own constituents. Your land ministry already has its own constituents. Your health ministry. So one of the pushes that I think will be really important will be what some of the countries have gone to. I think Mexico is one of the innovators in this, but it's been taken farther by other countries like Paraguay and some of the other Latin American countries, where you have a formal central, say, observatory or multi-stakeholder panel with some decision-making powers, but then you also have working groups that work on thematic issues and are able to dig a little bit deeper there, and that helps with this problem orientation problem. It helps get us past the capital city problem. It helps get us past the usual transparency and anti-corruption groups, who are great, but they're not the totality of civil society, and I don't think they would claim to be either. So I think that's where we need to go as a next step. New participation guidelines will be coming out, or they're already out for OGP, and hopefully that can help governments begin to adopt this more problem-oriented working model, increasingly decentralized and open working model, which I think will help to make OGP more sustainable. One more question before we call it?
Well, a question to close.
Sure.
Yeah, final question was, what do you think, what are your main recommendations for countries that are currently developing their action plans based on the end of term reports that are coming out?
Right. Each person do one quick one.
I'm definitely going to steal Hille's statement, which is problem orientation. I think that if they can figure out how to articulate what is the problem that they're trying to address and how the activities that they propose connect to this problem, that goes a long way just for even practical government planning. Because one of the things that we do see is a great large statement of what the problem is, but then when you drill down to what they're actually trying to do, there isn't necessarily that kind of connection. And I think that's one of the early indications that there will be a challenge in implementing the meaningful reforms, even if everyone is on the same page that there's a problem and agrees that there should be a solution.
I mean, I think it's kind of the age-old dilemma of balancing ambition and realism, right? What can they actually do? What can they actually make meaningful progress on? But what of that will be meaningful to citizens and meaningful and leave a legacy, going forward?
Yeah. And so supporting that sentiment, yes, it's okay to reduce the scale of action plans. And as the data shows, the more ambitious commitments tend to be completed and accomplished in the same way as the less ambitious ones. So why not go for higher ambition and staying focused at the same time? And there's plenty of potential that these will be actually materialized.
I mean, I think focus is important. I think ownership is also incredibly important. And it also would make much more kind of interest from all different stakeholders in making it work. But so I think ownership and then impact. But impact in terms of two levels. One is a lot of them opening data, access to information, opens up a whole range which don't have immediate visible impact. Whereas other things on very specific issues, air pollution, public health, you may actually see clear potential outputs. But I think to develop the recommendations so that there's stakeholder analysis, impact assessment is going to really increase the effectiveness of the commitments in implementation. But they shouldn't be going just for start commitments in terms of immediate impact. They should be taking a holistic approach.
The right mix of feasibility and ambition, the right mix of problem orientation, but also big, wide, strategic scaffolding.
And how to do all of this is, of course, ownership begins in the design phase. So get people in and get serious about it. I know a very simple recipe, but a working one.
Great. That was an amazing last question, because they were able to ask the question, which actually was all my summary points were hit here from everyone. So whoever that is, your check is in the mail. And we'll wrap up, I guess, here. Thank you guys for attending. Again, this is the preliminary results. We'll have a more complete paper for you in, 4 months? So we'll have but please do send us your thoughts. Thank you for attending. I know it's early in the morning for some of you and late at night for others. And have a good day. Thank you very much.